With the constant cycle of fight card offerings every weekend, the strict programming with the Contender Series and the decaying corpse of Tough, and the domination of the global market share, it's hard to envision a time when the UFC wasn't the top brand in mixed martial arts. But while politicians, boxing purists, and moral watchdog groups were clutching their pearls about the reprehensible new type of sporting entertainment, Japan was having a grand old time as martial artists from around the world gathered in the ring, strapped on the blue gloves, and had some good old no-holds-barred fun. Sure, nostalgia might make us look back a little too fondly over the years that Pride was the top dog, but fuck it, here we are. I'm Tom from MMA On Point, and here are 10 things that were definitely better in Pride. Number 10, cross-divisional fights. Nowadays, it seems like the moment someone wins a belt, their next move is to call out the champion in the next weight class and open the door to everyone but the next rightful contenders. And also now we see fighters like Donald Cerrone and Anthony Pettis go up and down the scale as they please, but Pride was the real home of cross-divisional action. With the oversight of state athletic commissions, the open weight tournaments of the original UFC events became a thing of the past, as regulators were reluctant to see huge weight disparities between fighters. Pride not only kept the tournament formats, but welcomed open weight action with open arms. But with only 2 open weight Grand Prix held over the 10-year lifespan over the promotion, that doesn't leave us much more room for variety on the scale. But there was a fair amount of movement up and down the scale in Pride. Beyond the obvious names that would have been super heavyweights in North America, the company can boast having the first champ with Dan Henderson, who simultaneously held the middleweight and welterweight titles. Number 9, contracts. Since free agency has become a more frequent topic of conversation surrounding the rosters of the major fight promotions, it's important to look back on something that Pride was unique with compared to the sport's current landscape. The company wasn't nearly as restrictive on the athletes as we see now. For example, fighters were given leeway to pursue other combat endeavors without jeopardizing their place on the roster. During Fedor's legendary run in the promotion, he was allowed to step outside of their ring to compete in rings and the 2003 Inoki Bumbaye, in addition to continuing his career in combat sambo. You might recall that was one of the sticking points in negotiations that kept the Russian champion from ever competing in the UFC. And the next best thing to a non-exclusive contract is a one-fight deal. Unlike the stories of fighters like Nate Diaz, Sean O'Malley, Luke Rockhold, Jorge Masvidal, John Jones, etc., who have all had grievances about pay only to be dismissed because they have signed a contract, a one-fight deal lets someone who suddenly has more popularity capitalize by earning more for the next bout without banking on the promotion's goodwill to enter a negotiation. This, of course, is one of the reasons why Pride was known to hand out the biggest paydays in the sport during its heyday. It's also worth noting that Chuck Liddell's lone Pride fight before he entered the storied 2003 Grand Prix against Guy Mezger was made possible with one of those one-fight contracts. Number 8, the theme song. Perhaps one of the more dreadful things about the UFC has been the continued presence of the dreaded Face the Pain. Sure, the song tapped into the youthful angst that fueled the company's boom period, but it has lingered way too long.
Lingerer, man.
Yeah, totally.
Linger.
Fortunately, it no longer has a place on the broadcast. However, if you're in the arena for a pay-per-view event, the ear-bleeding collection of noises will plague you as the main card begins. And if you're in the arena, chances are you'll be subjected to more new metal throughout. But let's juxtapose with the theme song from Pride. Heavy drums and melodic strings, just a beautiful blend of varied instruments that perfectly captured a cinematic vibe that added a level of intrigue that neither Stem nor Fred Durst could honestly ever accomplish. Just look at the collective eye rolls when the UFC broadcasts included Face the Pain, compared to the gleeful response to Rampage Jackson representing his old promotional home while walking out at UFC 123. Number 7, the pageantry. So about that endless cycle of fights we mentioned earlier, even with the highest caliber of athletes and compelling matchups, the product can sometimes feel a bit stale. And even before the pandemic confined the octagon to just a few isolated venues, everything felt kind of the same anyways. The cage floor, the decor of the arena, it almost doesn't certainly matter where they are. Because aesthetically, it's all the same as the desk analysts talk in between bouts that could honestly be interchangeable to the events of the surrounding weeks. But Pride certainly didn't have that problem. They made every event an event. It just grand opening ceremonies, pyrotechnics, performance walkouts, even an action movie style trailer preceding Fedor versus Crow Cop. There was an appreciation for the spectacle.
This is a boy who genuinely loves pageantry.
While the UFC in particular deserves credit for MMA being recognized as a more legitimate sport, it has homogenized the product to the point of losing the showmanship that highlights the outlandish personalities that make up this sometimes absurd circus. And while they did get a tad out of hand when it comes to the amount of time that they spent on the show, it served as an excellent palate cleanser for the folks who weren't exactly gung-ho about the brutal fights. Number 6, judging. While Dana White's infamous phrase, "don't leave it in the hands of the judges," is overly simplistic and pretty much dismisses the difficulty in finishing a high-level opponent, there's a reason why it's been repeated so many times. Judging in mixed martial arts just absolutely sucks. And there are a ton of examples of the wrong person getting their hand raised with the highest stakes on the line, and even when the right person wins, there are far too many times that an off-the-beaten-path scorecard confuses everyone watching and wondering if one of the 3 judges has problems with basic arithmetic. Part of the problem is the 10-point must system adopted from boxing. However, in Pride, instead of awarding 10 points or less per round, a fight was actually judged in its entirety. This usually meant that gaining momentum as the fight went on weighed more than gaining an advantage early, as the later moments would be fresher in the judges' minds. So when Pride made its way over to the United States, the Nevada Athletic Commission oversaw the proceedings and they had to adopt the scoring. Fortunately, both times they made their way across the ocean, there was only one decision on each card. Distancing itself from boxing scorecards also helped prevent the same mentality being applied to MMA, as longer fights and a smaller list of variables made the scoring better suited for the sweet science. Number 5, less regulation. Regulation is generally a good thing. It is. The idea behind it makes sense. Fighter safety, financial security, and consistently enforced rules are some of the obvious benefits. The problem is, regulators have a habit of taking away our fun, and one thing Pride gave us was a lot of goddamn fun. I mean, just look at the ridiculous matchmaking they had. Giant Silver versus Ikehisa Minowa, Big Nog versus Bob Sapp, Fedor versus Zulu Zinio, Butterbean for God's sake. Even when it wasn't completely outrageous, open weight fights like Crow Cop versus Vanderlei Silva wouldn't have ever been allowed stateside. Just look at what didn't happen when Pride set up show in Las Vegas. What would have been a fever dream of the bazaar between Mark Hunt and Butterbean, it was just stopped. How sad is that? Without the shackles of the government oversight, there would have been no stopping Nobuyuki Sakakibara and the Yakuza from putting it together. And yes, the constant focus on PED testing and suspensions is understandably in place for safety purposes. That doesn't mean seeing roided up monsters isn't fun, because it was a hell of a lot of fun. Clinging tight to the pro wrestling origins of Japanese MMA, fighters were not only allowed to juice up, but they were actually contractually encouraged to do so. Are we hypocrites now? I don't know. Maybe. Probably. Number 4, fight gear / gloves. While this would be a perfect time to continue slandering the soon-to-be defunct Reebok deal, it honestly wouldn't be fair. Because as far as individuality is concerned, the UFC and Pride were neck and neck in regards to fighter trunks at the time. In fact, it's where Anderson Silva established his Game of Death inspired black and yellow, and Rampage Jackson decided jewelry could be found at your local DIY shop. And yeah, occasional gis were cool, but let's be honest, they weren't exactly the most functional as the sport evolved. But Pride was way ahead of the game when it came to the gloves, as we see an abundance of eye pokes, including the regrettable fact that the trilogy to determine the heavyweight GOAT was partially decided by them. It's incredible to think the UFC has been content to continue using those flat gloves that encouraged outstretched fingers. But with a curved design that kept fingers from completely pointing forward, pokes were much less commonplace. And before any of you guys start talking about how grappling requires 3 fingers, there was no lack of exquisite work in Pride in that department with those blue gloves. Additionally, the pre-curve helps reduce handbrakes, another common problem in the UFC. Even Bellator jumped on board with a similar style to protect their fighters. Bellator, well done Scott Coker. While the design exists, including one created by striking coach Trevor Whitman, so far the promotion has passed on solving this big problem. Come on Dana, get it together. Number 3, cross promotion. In case you forgot, Dana's dismissive reply when asked about cross-promoted championship fights should remind you what the world's #1 MMA organization feels about working with its competition.
With who? With Bellator. With who?
But that wasn't always the case. The #1 MMA organization in the world used to welcome co-promotion and collaboration with its rivals. That's because Pride worked with fellow Japanese promotion K1 to put on the Pride Shockwave Dynamite hybrid card. And the unity turned into a tremendous success. The 2002 event, which blended MMA and kickboxing notables like Sakuraba, Ernesto Hughes, Vanderlei Silva, and Jerome Labana, set the attendance record at 71,000. By comparison, the second and third place on that list are KSW 39, which packed 57,766 into an arena, and UFC 243, which saw 57,127 packed into Marvel Stadium. When the UFC began gaining momentum on the backs of stars like Randy Couture, Tito Ortiz, and Chuck Liddell, Pride welcomed Liddell into the 2003 Middleweight Grand Prix, hoping to see the knockout artist test himself against their corresponding talent Vanderlei Silva. And as the number 2 in that equation, the UFC was more than happy to sit at the table with their rivals. That changed, however, when Zuffa bought out Pride and closed its doors. And other promotions have flirted with the formula that made the Shockwave event so memorable, most notably Bellator and Rizin exchanging champions in Darian Caldwell and Kyoji Horiguchi, and collabing on the 2019 New Year's Eve card. Of course, there was a co-promotion involving the fight with Mayweather and McGregor, but the UFC wasn't the A side in that equation. Number 2, tournaments. If you've been a fan of the sport long enough, you'll look back fondly on the tournament format. As contenders are now sometimes forced to play the game of trash talk and politics to get the title shot that their in-cage results have earned, and even then you're still not really guaranteed an opportunity because it's all at the whims of the company. But with a clearly defined path to goal, the Grand Prix eliminates that uncertainty. With the sanctioning of MMA in the US, the UFC largely abandoned the idea as their early events featured tournaments in which a fighter would have to compete 3 times in just a single night. Forced to move on from the marathon evenings due to fighter safety concerns, they chose a more subjective approach to moving up the ladder. Pride certainly had their one-off fights, but the Grand Prix became a staple of the organization and the vehicle that created several of their stars like Shogun Rua and Dan Henderson. Notice the excitement that surrounds Grand Prix in more recent years. Strikeforce's heavyweight tournament, which featured 5 Pride vets, became the crowning achievement of the promotion before Zuffa absorbed them. And Scott Coker revisited this format for Bellator, producing some memorable moments and generating renewed interest in the company. And considering the success of the inaugural flyweight tournament, it's a safe bet that Grand Prix would be more than welcomed by UFC fans. And number 1, the rule set. Remember that pearl clutching and outrage over MMA that we mentioned earlier? Well, good thing they weren't watching what was going on in Pride, because honestly, they would have absolutely lost their minds to see soccer kicks and head stomps. Not only did they look absolutely badass in action, but they also helped keep the action fluid. Wrestlers couldn't always rely on stalling on failed takedown attempts, as knees would be the obvious counter. And someone laying on their back inviting an unwilling opponent into their guard might be met with a stomp for their troubles. And soccer kicks were just another tool to prevent wayward takedown attempts if failure meant exposing yourself. Plus, as the confusion between the varied versions of the unified rules related to downed opponents, the blanket rule of everyone can get it is just so much simpler. Also, occasional knockouts occur with elbows, but they typically just open up cuts. So Pride just banned them to the head to prevent doctor stoppages. And while we're used to refs being very hesitant to hand out any kind of penalties for fighters being timid, the officials in Pride had absolutely no problem tossing out any kind of yellow cards when someone stopped engaging. And yeah, we're not a big fan of the financial penalty associated with the yellow cards, but watching Israel Adesanya and Yoel Romero stare at each other for 25 minutes makes us wish some form of this would make its way to the octagon. Thanks so much to Ant Walker for writing this list. You can go follow him at Ant Walker MMA. And thanks so much to Tommy Walsh for editing it. You can follow him at Big Beat Visual. Also, thanks so much to the man Ben Rosette, composer of the intro music. Please go check out his music by clicking the link in the description below and catch the latest updates on his Instagram and Twitter page at Ben Rosette. Thanks for watching that video. Please do like and subscribe. We upload 3 jaw-droppingly juicy MMA videos a week to get your teeth into, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Make sure to follow us at OnPoint MMA and Tom A. Ransom on Twitter, and you make sure you have a great day.